We're in John 17. John 17. Gospel of John 17. Some commentators have referred to this series of chapters 13 through 17 as the upper room discourses. The only problem with that is they leave the upper room, but I guess that would still fit into the beginning of it, because the chapter 13 begins in the upper room and then they move from the upper room, and he continues those discourses in chapters 14, 15, 16, 17, concludes. As you look at 18, you find there's some teaching going on there as well, but really 17 is the last major chapter that will give you that completion or the conclusion of his of those discourses. When you reach 18, you get to a very emotional, tug at your heart kind of moment as Jesus experiences the arrest and the purposefully moving toward that cross. And it's a very emotionally difficult section that begins in chapter 18. But to me, it is, though it's so different because we're talking about the arrest and the trials, those emotional trials that Jesus will undergo, and then obviously the crucifixion is emotional and painful, and it's so thick with passion, thus the passion idea. But it is, I think, in these chapters where Jesus gives the opportunity for his disciples to have some last instruction from him in these discourses, that is also on a completely different level, but it is also very emotional. These chapters are very emotional because, as you've seen in the upper room in chapter 13, that setting is just thick with emotion and feeling, and the action that goes on in that room is just passionate, but not the same way as you'll find beginning in chapter 18. But still, the passion that Jesus exhibits toward his disciples, the desire to teach them and help them understand, and then the desire that their hearts be comforted because he's told them he's leaving and he desires to have their hearts comforted. So in these final chapters of the Gospel of John, when I say final, really looking at 13 all the way through the end, because those take place, well, the crucifixion all takes place within a week or within a day, and then you have the next resurrection appearances after that would conclude the Gospel of John. But you have this tension of these chapters. But one of the things that we need to remember is that the tension between belief and unbelief is still going on here, even in these chapters when he's talking to his disciples. Remember, we began to discuss, as we started studying from the Gospel of John, that the tension between belief and unbelief is what John is dealing with very significantly in this gospel. There is the evidence that he lays out, and you're going to have some that are going to believe and some that are going to reject. Some that will receive the message and some that will reject the message. Some that will become believers and some that will not. As a matter of fact, you have that tension that you have those who say he's from God or no, he's from the devil, and you have that vast disagreement, and John describes that in a great way. So you have this tension between belief and unbelief, and that's really going to come to this crescendo in chapter 18, because here he is being demonstrated right on the very body of the Son of God, the unbelief. when he is actually crucified. So you have that tension that takes place. Unbelief takes its greatest toll on humanity as the unbelief takes the life of Jesus. Yet belief is still very significant because you have those gathered around the cross. You have those who are there as Jesus dies, and those who would even say he is the Son of God. And so you have that tension, and I just wanted to remind us of that belief-unbelief idea that's still going on, though Jesus is talking to his disciples here in these chapters, still talking about this difficulty of getting that message across. And I think even the disciples are struggling with that. Help our unbelief. I'll only believe if if I can see that tension is going to show up as we move through. So Jesus is decisively moving and has been moving toward the cross, and this last night of his life, he ends these discourses with this prayer. And I know that Earl taught this a few weeks ago. It's been several weeks, and I'd planned on skipping it, but I thought, well, this would be it wouldn't be right to skip it, would it, after we've spent so much time on 13, 14, 15, 16. So let's talk about chapter 17. It is the prayer of Jesus. It is a very moving prayer of Jesus. It is the prayer where he prays for himself, he prays for his disciples, and he prays for future believers, prays for those three groups. Now, in chapter 17, his earthly works are going to be over, basically. When you get into 18, you're going to have a very brief part where he's going to have some opportunity to do some teaching, and even before Pilate, he's going to be able to make some statements that are very telling. But in reality, when chapter 17 ends and there's that Garden of Gethsemane experience, and my accusers are here, so there's the exit, and he comes to realization that his earthly ministry is now complete. He's done what he came to do, so he surrenders himself to those who've come to arrest him. From that perspective, he closes it out with this prayer. And in those first few verses of this chapter, chapter 17, 1 through 5, Jesus speaks on his own behalf. Someone read 17, 1 through 5, please.
Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you, since you have given him authority over all flesh to give eternal life to all who have given him. And this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you have given me to do. And now, Father, glorify me in your own presence, with the glory that I had with you before the world existed.
Okay, very good. 1 through 5, Jesus is talking about how his time has come. The time for me to be glorified has come. Now, up to this time, Jesus has described the fact that it has not come. The first of those in John chapter 2, verse 4. The time has not yet come. But now he says, my time has come. Now, from his own testimony, from his own mouth, you have the statement that it is now time. Up till now, it hasn't been my time yet. It hasn't been the time for me to be glorified, for there to be this consummation of the plan of God, the finality of the plan of God that's going to take place upon my crucifixion. So he asks that he be one who would not only be glorified, but that I would glorify. Now, one of the things that is true about Jesus, as it is about us, is that we want to receive the holiness that God gives us when we become a Christian, thus being holy. But we also want to live a life of holiness so that that life of holiness glorifies God. Now, of course, this is not the same idea of what Jesus is saying here, but the idea that God has glorified Jesus and I want to glorify you is the same idea. I'm going to glorify you by my obedience and doing what I came to do. I'm going to do my duty. I'm going to follow through on the very purpose for which I came. As we look at those verses, he says, I glorified you on earth. I accomplished the work you gave me to do. And now glorify me in your own presence. The event that's about to take place is weighing heavy on Jesus. The Garden of Gethsemane is going to prove that, though John doesn't record that Garden of Gethsemane event. It's going to prove that that moment is weighing heavy on Jesus. It is not something that he's just moving through without any emotion or any feeling or any anxiety. He's not moving in that direction without any of that. The garden scene shows us that. So he says, the moment that I am glorified will be a moment in which you, Father, are also glorified. Now, the very gospel message is a message of that, and that is that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That is the gospel message. And as a result of that, then, God is glorified not only by the fact that Jesus came, but the fact that Jesus came because of the love of God and how much he was willing to give on our behalf. Now, maybe you have some observations further on those first 5 verses. I think a significant introduction to what's taking place here in chapter 17 as he moves directly from his instruction to the disciples about the tribulation of this world. You're going to experience this great tribulation in the world because of your commitment to me and because of your faith. But you should not fear because, see how he puts it, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And of course it opens up by saying when Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and said. So he begins his prayer there after that in chapter 17, verse 1. Any observations you'd like to make?
They're saying it's proof. He's telling the truth. This is before the world began. Mm-hmm. This is it. I mean, I am who I say I am. It's just a proof that I was there before the world existed. I mean, it's just, that's what I'm saying, it's just proof.
Yeah. One of the characteristics of what Jesus has done all along is to say that I have things that testify of me. We talked about those many times. What John is saying is this is just another opportunity where Jesus says, I was there in the beginning, I've been there the whole time, and another one of those statements about that proof.
The gospel starts with that.
Yes.
The Word, it was not only Jesus, but he was also the Word.
Yeah, John starts with that, and here Jesus opens up this prayer with it. Anything else?
Verse 4, you say, I accomplished everything you gave me to do.
Mm-hmm.
Premillennialists said that God didn't get through, that he's going to come back and set up an earthly kingdom because he needed to get king.
Right.
That refutes it. Jesus is on.
Yeah. Earl's statement is from chapter 17, verse 4, that Jesus says, I accomplished what you gave me to do. Therefore, he's not coming back to finish any work. He's not going to try to complete something that he wasn't able to finish. He wasn't caught off guard. There was nothing that surprised him. Everything moved along as God had planned it. The church was established, which was his kingdom, and that kingdom will be those who are going to spend eternity with him in heaven. So that nullifies any other plan we might want to come up with that Jesus didn't quite finish what he had in mind.
Very as many times as the Pharisees had tried to arrest him, people had tried to kill him and all this. We read before this, it says, but his hour had not yet come.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the disciples were thinking when he said that? The hour's come now.
Well, I know that they probably didn't understand what was really about to happen, maybe other than they knew something really big was about to happen. And whatever that was, if they thought...
I say that all those other times, they were actually trying to get him
yes.
stuff and didn't. Thinking back later, they had to know, he really was the Son of God.
Right.
He knew.
Yeah, you think about it on the other side of the cross and all of that tumultuous time from the arrest to the resurrection. That was a hard time for the disciples. But once they get on the other side of that and Jesus appears for those 40 days and they are with him for those next few days till he resurrects, till he returns to heaven, and then they're waiting for those 10 days in Jerusalem until the Holy Spirit comes. And so during that time, I think that there was some reflection time. And maybe that's one of those things they reflected back on. Oh, so that's what he meant. My time has come. There are a lot of things that we can look at in these verses specifically that describe how Jesus glorified God. And let me just highlight a couple of those when I think about how Jesus glorified God. One of those ways that Jesus glorified God is he describes here in these verses 2 through 4, is he glorified God by his works. I did what you told me to do. I did what I came to do. I did what my mission was. So he glorified God by his works. He glorified God by doing what he was supposed to do. In John chapter 3, verse 35, there is a statement where it says he has given all things into his hands, meaning God has given all things into Jesus' hands. And Jesus here proclaims the fact that I glorify God because I was successful in doing your work. There was another way that he glorified him, and that's actually in verse 6. He says in verse 6, I have manifested your name to the people whom you gave me out of this world. Yours they were, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Jesus says, I manifested your name to the people. His message, really, you read all the way through verse 8. I gave them the words you gave me. Verse 8 says, there are a couple of statements like that all the way through verse 8. But he says, I gave the message you gave me to give. I preached the words you gave me to preach. I said the things you gave me to say. So it was his message that Jesus would speak, and by that message he would also glorify God. There are a lot of those things that Jesus would say. One of those to Nicodemus in John 3, unless a man be born again, he cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. Chapter 6, I am the bread which comes down from heaven. Chapter 7, if you continue in my word. All the way through the Gospel of John, it just seems that he's speaking the word. And I would say every time he says, I am, like in chapter 11, I am the resurrection and the life. Those are all the message of the servant Christ. And his message proclaims the fact that I am doing the will of my Father. I'm bearing his message. And as a matter of fact, I am God's message. You just watch me, you just follow me, and I am going to glorify God by demonstrating to you God's message in the flesh. So that certainly would be a way that he would be glorified. One of the ways that he also glorifies God is the way that he yielded himself to the Father. In these verses here, he's describing the fact that I yielded myself to you. I yielded myself to your will. I have surrendered myself. The passage that really comes to mind when we think about that is Philippians 2. That passage really describes the fact that he was God, but he emptied himself and he took on the form of a servant. Therein, I think, glorifying God through that as well. He glorified God by his life and these specific things, but now what he's pointing forward to is, I will glorify God by my death. I will glorify him by the death that I am about to experience. I'll glorify him by completing that mission for which I came. The hour is not yet come. I'm not sure about those chapters. I know it's chapter 2, verse 4, but I think it's also in 7 and yes, maybe I think another time in 7. But now he says, by his own admission, it is now time for me to glorify the Father by my surrender to death. It's time for the Son of Man to be glorified. I believe John 12 is one of those. Anyway, I should have gone back and looked at those. All right, observations. Anything else? So, kind of expounded a little bit on how Jesus glorified God. Any other ideas or comments?
Carrying all that, looking at that verse, what you said, there's kind of a lesson in that, because even knowing what he was about to endure and suffer, his main focus was still on glorifying God. And by him doing that, we achieve salvation. Mm-hmm. So, you can look at it at any time that the glory of God is focused on, it's really to our good.
Exactly, yeah. Ryan's point is that when he focuses on glorifying God with his life, it is for our benefit. As a matter of fact, everything that Jesus did in glorifying God was for our benefit, because we have it written down in the Gospels. We have the record that we can read and that we can understand and that we can respond to. And as John's book is written, his gospel is written to give us that evidence in order to be able to respond correctly with faith. Yeah, good observation. Anything else? Well, let me go back and read 6 through 8, and that will kind of that will really talk about Jesus' prayer for himself and the things that he describes there. John read 1 through 5. Let me pick up in 6 again and read 6 through 8. I have manifested your name to the people whom you gave me out of this world. Yours they were, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they know that everything that you have given me is from you. For I have given them the words that you gave me, and they have received them and have come to know in truth that I came from you, and they have believed that you sent me. I am praying for them. I'm not praying for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours. And then he continues, that's through 9 actually. Read that, give you an introduction into that second section, I think, which is the prayer for the disciples in 9 through 18. Now, in 9 through 17 or 18, depending on where you cut it off, Jesus talks about how the disciples have also benefited the world by the way that they glorified God with their actions. Did you notice in those verses that one of the things that Jesus says about them is that they accepted the word that Jesus gave them, and as they responded to that correctly, he says, they know in truth that I came from you. Again, I don't know how much they understood, but the very words of Jesus here in these 6 through 8, I guess really, Jesus says, I gave them the word, they received that word, and they know, they believe, and they have believed that you have sent me. And I'm praying for them, praying for the world, and so forth, beginning in verse 9. So, though the world as in number, the largest number of people in the world had not decided to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. There were some followers, there were some who believed, there were some that we see through the gospel accounts that had followed him, and some turned away, and some followed him for bread, and some were following him because of curiosity, and there were all kinds of reasons. So when he dies, he has this, what would be compared to the rest of the world, a small number of believers. And yet what we find is that he brags on the disciples here by saying that in this setting, they believed the message that I preached. They did. They believed it. They believed it. They acknowledged from his teaching that he was from God, I think implying, and I think when you read on through, I think 10, 11, 12 along in there also would back that up as well. Any observations about the believing of the disciples? We give them a hard time, but Jesus bragged on them pretty well right there, didn't he?
But I can focus on how the belief was through the word, that they were able to come to the knowledge of the truth, the final conclusion of his identity and mission through the word.
Okay, very good. Tomello says he's impressed by the way that Jesus highlights the fact that they came to that conclusion of who he is through the Word. It wasn't through some kind of, well, you know, if I had seen Lazarus raised from the dead, that might convince me pretty well. But Jesus doesn't say that. He says it's through the Word. Now, was all of that the Word? Well, yeah, I think all of that would be included in that, but they do hear the Word. Good. So one of the things that makes them unique is that these disciples are not like the rest of the world. Remember, I said that Jesus doesn't have what seems to be this huge following, especially once he goes to the cross. Where is everybody? Where did all those followers go? Where did those people go? Those thousands that were following him for the bread for their belly. Where did they all go? Well, it seems that the disciples were the ones who were following him. Pick up in verse 10 again. I think I'll just go ahead and read through 19. That'll be a good place to break off. In verse 10, he says, all mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I am glorified in them. And I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I am coming to you, Holy Father. Keep them in your name, which you have given me, that they may be one, even as we are one. While I was with them, I kept them in your name, which you have given me. I have guarded them, and not one of them has been lost, except the son of destruction, that the scripture might be fulfilled. But now I am coming to you, and these things I speak in the world, that they may know, that they may have my joy fulfilled in them, in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake I consecrate myself, that they also may be sanctified in truth. One of the things that Jesus highlights here is that his disciples are not like the world. They are in the world like I was in the world, but in the same way that I was not like everybody else in the world, my disciples are not like the world. And then he brings back what he's already talked about earlier in these discourses, and that is that you're going to be persecuted because you are not like the world, because you do not act like the world, you don't think like the world, you are not like everybody else, and so therefore you're going to be persecuted for my name's sake. So one of the ways that they would glorify God, as Jesus describes it here, is that they are not going to be like everybody else, the unbelievers.
But what made them that way was not anything particularly special about them. I mean, they were selected, they were just common people. They were fishermen, they were tax collectors, they were just like anybody else. What ended up making them that way was what he's already said about the words of Jesus and being with Jesus and seeing Jesus. And it was Jesus that made them special and stand out. And there's a hopefulness in that too, because anybody and everybody has that opportunity if you come to Jesus.
Right.
Because it's Jesus that makes you separate and that consecrates you and sanctifies you and makes you stand out.
Very good. Yeah, Gary's observation is that they have come to that place, they've come to that point of belief through the Word, through being with Jesus, through all of their association with Jesus. And what's great is it gives us hope, because in the same way, we can, as ordinary, everyday, general fishermen and whoever we might be, just like the disciples, we can glorify God by our association with Jesus, just like they did. Yeah, good observation. We know that throughout the New Testament there are many opportunities for us to be exhorted to be separate from the world, not be conformed to the world. The idea from Romans 12, Titus 2, denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should still live righteously godly, soberly righteously godly in this present world. Different, not like the world, that we're different. And as a result of that, the disciples are going to glorify God because they take sides, and they take the side of God, and they take that side with God in spite of the fact that they are going to be and that they are persecuted. That glorifies God. I think there are very few times when God stands and gives an ovation. I think that's surely one of them, don't you? When his people believe to death.
There's a profound sort of psychological idea in there too, which is, as a father, I have a tendency to want to protect my children, pull them out of adversity and struggle and suffering. Jesus says, you're going to be persecuted in the world. And then he says, not only am I not pulling you out of the world, I am the one sending you into the world.
Mm-hmm. And
so, it speaks to the reality of God allowing suffering, and the almost the necessity, as we mentioned, last time when we were looking at chapter 16, sorrow turning into joy, sort of that idea, the making application of it as a parent. I can't overprotect my children because that's not going to help them develop and grow. And growth growth is struggling through adversity. And, so James talks about the trial of your faith, working patience, working endurance. And so, but we have a tendency to when we suffer, and kind of go to, well, I thought God loves me, and that kind of thing. And sometimes love is letting you struggle because that's how you grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good observation. I won't try to repeat all you said to the audience, but the great observation that Gary gave was that not only did Jesus say, you're going to be persecuted, but he said, I'm sending you into the world where you're going to be persecuted. And so it's that's I think very telling, because with that, one of the purposes behind that was for their growth spiritually, psychologically, in every way.
It also is an expression of confidence.
Yes.
It's just like with Job, when God says, have you considered my servant Job, and lets him be tortured. It's the same kind of confidence with these disciples. Like, I've prepared you, and now I'm sending you out into the world, and it's going to be rough and it's going to be hard, but I have faith in you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that God would allow us to be tempted in that way, would face trials and difficulties, means that he has faith in us to be his people in the world. Exactly.
Yeah. Very special point that you make that demonstrates his confidence in them, for sure. All right, any observations about that?
Also along the lines of what he said, verse 14, whether he was given them and going responsible for all of that, responsible for the change, responsible for the hate of the world, the suffering they're going to, and yet it's the very thing that's going to bring them back to joy at the same time.
All right, good point. Tomello points out verse 14 that says it's the word that they obey that brings salvation, but it also is the reason they are hated, and it brings about the persecution, that very word that does all of that. So their belief, their unwillingness to conform to the world and be different and to accept persecution, and the fact that they will carry the message into the world is also a way that they'll glorify him. In verse 18, notice he says, as you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. Now, they're not just going into the world. They're not just going to go and hurry through it. They're going to go and take the message. They're going to be bearers of that message. And Jesus says, just in the same way that I went, they're going. I've sent them. So the bearing the message is a way that they're also going to glorify God, by being bearers of that good news. And we're going to see that immediately in chapter 2 of the book of Acts. They're going to bear that message into the world. So now, verse 20 through 24, and I think our time's really up, but let me just kind of refer to how present day we can glorify God in the same way. He describes the way that we can glorify God in verse 20 by also believing. He describes how we can glorify God by having unity, verses 21 through 23. He describes how we can glorify God in many different ways by our righteousness, by the life we live, by believing, by unity, by becoming like Jesus. Notice 21 through 24. Or 20 through 24, and then we'll close. I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, and that they might all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, and they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, and they will be one even as we are one, I in them and you in me, and they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. Now, I think my time's up, but that gives you an idea of how we, as Jesus talks about the present day church, how we can honor him by believing, how we can honor him with unity. By the way, that unity is really harped on there in those verses, and how we can honor him by conforming our lives to Christ. I appreciate your comments.